We are joined by Aaron Burnett, a founder and CEO at Mach 33 Financial Group. He is also CEO and managing editor for Mach 33 Financial Group's research, which is trusted by trillions of dollars in AUM and is considered the leading independent voice on SpaceX, orbital data centers, and the broader space investment program. Maybe a good place to start is, what is space all about here? I mean, I think you and I chatted about this earlier. There's a lot of excitement about simply exploring the solar system and beyond. But what you're here to talk about is something far broader than that, and that is the commercialization of space. Do you want to spend a moment or two just talking about that before we get into the flow of your comments?
Yeah, I think that the the space industry and what's coming up right now is heavily SpaceX oriented. I think it's a lot about that. If you invest in space or thinking about investing in space, I don't think this might be. I say this, it's fairly. I'm not sure how controversial, but it can create some binary reactions sometimes. But I think if you're not invested in SpaceX or have a very strong thesis on SpaceX, then you're not really a space investor. SpaceX is, for better or for worse, the vast majority of what is the commercial space ecosystem. There's obviously governments and defense and other stuff involved, and there are other commercial players, but like the big one is SpaceX. So, I think you can't really talk about the commercial side of space without it. But the other component that I think is important to this, and the SpaceX IPO, the forthcoming IPO here, is going to really highlight this for the financial markets, is that space is definitely a misunderstood kind of industry. The fact that it's even considered an industry is a misunderstanding of what it is. Space, at the end of the day, is a place, and as a result, it's a place where you can do business, interesting infrastructure in that place, and that's really what's happening over the next few years. The infrastructure side of it. Um, we can obviously go deeper, but I think that's like a nice starting point if you're thinking about space investing, what it means, and what's coming down the pipe over the next few years.
So, Aaron, you made a comment that sort of caught my attention. You said it's not an industry; it's a place. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit more? Um, what is it about this place that makes it conducive for commercial opportunity?
Yeah, it's not immediately yeah, it's not immediately obvious. It is kind of obvious, space being a place, it's a nice rhyme,
Yes.
but it's also true. Um, it's obvious that it is not just a, an industry, but when we think about it at the end of the day, the reason space being a place is important is because you can effectively have a lot of different types of business up there, and business models and things like that. It's just a place where operating a business is very difficult and has a lot of limits to even be considered a business up there. And so with that in mind, I think SpaceX is a good example, given that it is the biggest one. Um, and that is that SpaceX is coming out in an IPO. There are questions in, how do you even put this in the right spot in the GICs? Space kind of breaks the GICs. I think I'm slightly dramatizing it when I say space breaks the GICs, but it effectively does, because what you have with SpaceX is a aerospace and defense company that would fit nicely in that little category. But you also have a telco, a global telco. So is that a different category? And then you also have AI technology and things like that that are coming up. So is it kind of a horizontal across all GICs? Is it every business might be slightly different? Um, does everything just fit into this little bucket over here? That's really what you start to see as a problem. I like the GICs example, because I actually spent something like a year back in 4 years back or so, trying to figure out a way to force fit GICs, codes and things like that into space. And it was we were kind of like categorizing things. It didn't fundamentally work. And so you can do something, but there's all sorts of
Well,
caveats as
it
to
sounds like
if you
there
try
might
and make
be
it work.
a fair amount of crossover. on one hand, but on the other hand, if I'm hearing you right, there might be categories related to this place that we call space that might be new. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's new paradigms with space, and there's a reason you do business there, right? Like you can do telco on Earth. You know how telco is. You set up a
Sure.
set up a tower. The benefit of space is that it flips the paradigm from humans moving around cell towers and being connected, traditional internet kind of connection, cell towers or modems or whatever, to the modems slash cell towers are now moving around you, relatively speaking. Obviously, you're not standing still, but as a human with a cell phone or a terminal or whatever, they're moving around you. And what that does is it creates interesting opportunities where you can take advantage of that physical layout or the physics or engineering differences. In this case, with Starlink as an example, and Amazon's doing one as well with was called Kuiper, now called Amazon Leo.
Okay.
These these towers, the satellite and internet that's in space, they're effectively moving around you, and what that means is you, no matter where you go, you have a baseline coverage. You can get access to internet. Today, you need a terminal to do that. Tomorrow you will not. When I say tomorrow, it's the next iteration of these satellites. But that just uses the nature of what space is, which is effectively, being this close to the planet and in space means you have to move really fast, which means you have all these things moving around you. And that's just the nature of how you access and interact with space. But it gives these people, these businesses, a unique advantage where if you put enough of these towers up there, you have complete global coverage. You can be in the middle of the ocean, you can be in Antarctica, you can be, right, basically anywhere, and you'll be able to access. And it
So
allows them to take a different strategy.
so it sounds like space also, at least when it comes to things related to telecommunications, the advantage it brings is it's the proverbial high ground.
There's definitely a high ground component. There's a lot of defense reason for defense advantages for having the legitimately
Yes.
uh, high ground, not just proverbial. And so, yeah, it is high ground, but it's not just about vantage point. That's more of like let's call it kind of like a geographical advantage. In space, there's also, because of the nature of the physics, when you start moving that quickly, you effectively erase, going to oversimplify here, erase gravity. So there's all sorts of advantages when you erase gravity. When you leave Earth, you leave the atmosphere. You have pros and cons to leaving the atmosphere, but the pros you can use to leverage, for yourself. And a good example is the orbital data center thing, which a lot of folks here may believe, not believe, whatever. We've done the most orbital data center research in the last 7 months, and we just did this big report, 80-page institutional report that our clients pay us for. But that is, a lot of it's about how the physics work.
So
And
Aaron,
in space has a unique perspective.
so for those of us that are listening right now that are, let's say, less well initiated in this topic, what is an orbital data center?
So where if you're paying attention to the AI boom, you realize
Which
that
we haven't made. We
effectively,
spend a lot of time talking about
yeah.
AI, but go ahead. Thank you.
So you understand that there's this question around, what's the demand look like and all that. If you use AI yourself deeply, you know that there's effectively an infinite amount of demand. You can't really imagine how you couldn't use it more, if you're a heavy user of it. And so what that means is also we're seeing these companies like Anthropic, more and more and more and more ARR that seems to be coming in, driven by this demand. And then ultimately, it's creating a compute problem. If you use Anthropic's Claude, you see them, you know, using unique ways to kind of limit compute internally for themselves. They clearly have to get some more compute, and this is kind of the trend of the industry. So that's like the underlying trend and the underlying demand. Ultimately, what people like Elon Musk, Google, I'm just going to go down the line of a bunch of StarCloud. There's startups. There's really big. Eric Schmidt said this. I mean, there's a bunch of them. Bezos has said this. They're moving and putting data centers in space. And there's a whole bunch of reasons as to why that's the case and when it's going to be cheaper. Ultimately, it's going to be a cheaper opportunity because you're not going project by project. You get to turn a big building that holds computers into a manufacturable node, however you want to call it. And then you get to engage kind of the Wright's law learning rates about building these things more and more and more and more. Every time you double, it gets cheaper and easier to build these things. So that's fundamentally what's driving it, because a chip is only as good as needs to be plugged in to be any good. But if you have all the power in the world, you need the chips too.
Sure.
So basically, that's the thesis for orbital
And
data
and
centers at
I think, as you
high level.
said, space is in space will encounter less friction. Is that the case?
When you're outside the atmosphere, there's many, many, many different physical advantage, pros and
Yeah.
cons. And when you're outside the atmosphere, yes, you have little to no friction. One of the things is you're also in, depending on how you're facing the sun, you're in a very cold environment. You can use radiative heating. You have what's effectively free energy. Obviously, there's capex investment up front to capture it with large solar panels, but your operating expenses go down dramatically. You're not plugging into a grid. You're just bringing your ability to capture the energy with you.
So,
And there's plenty of advantages to doing it in
so
space.
would we be saying here that conducting business in space, as you just described, is an alternative to, let's say, SMRs here on Earth?
Yeah, it's there's kind of a break even at what point it makes sense to do this stuff. Fundamentally, one of the biggest drivers of cost on data centers, um, like if you were to take the chips out, so chips are still like I want to say 30-40% of the total cost of a data center, but that remains the same in space or on Earth. If you take that out, the costs on these 60% of the costs are coming from the the land, building it up, the capex to build that. On Earth, you have a project by project requirement. It's we're seeing dramatic problems in getting these data centers, built. We're seeing something like 50% of them being, denied or not, basically pulled because they can't get the access to the power, or there's a local NIMBY kind of uprising or moratoriums. I mean, all of those reasons why you can't get them built. And so anyway, the reality is if you've ever looked at Baumal's cost disease, which is those kind of that famous chart where you have like the red lines moving up and the blue lines going down, and then the blue is the TVs, and on the
Yes.
red is like medical costs and stuff like that. It's the same reason. If you were to plot that chart for a data center, you have to go through project by project. Even if you got a 10 gigawatt data center approved, it's one project, and then every incremental gigawatt that you're trying to add to this becomes harder and harder and costs increase over time. If you turn that into a manufacturing problem instead of a bureaucratic project problem, then you get to capture the exact opposite, which is the cost reduction, because as you build more
I see.
satellites, you get more and more and more of those cost efficiencies over time.
So it's a matter of
So
scale.
yeah, it's a matter of scale. Someone just raised, Peter Thiel just backed a company. I'm going to mess up the name, Panthalassa or something, um, that's doing ocean data centers. It's the same fundamental principle, which is, I'm going to swap out a project by project for me being able to build basically the same nodes at a very large scale, maybe millions and millions of these things, and throw them out in the ocean and capture energy that's there locally. They want to capture wave energy. Same fundamental principle. Question just is about how much does this scale? So fundamentally, if there's only going to be another 100 gigawatts of AI compute, which I don't believe that to be the case. But if it's anything past that number, and maybe we could argue it's not 100, it's 200 or 500, but it's somewhere in the like hundreds of gigawatts range, more than likely. Anything beyond that number, you need to figure out how you can swap out a project by project for a manufacturing version of
Ah,
this. Um, SMRs are great. We're going to need so much power. I don't think it isn't a SMRs aren't good. We have an investment in a company that does this stuff, the SMR stuff. So like, I know it's going to be a big deal, but the reality is there's certain use cases where you know large scale energy makes sense to go a certain way, And there's certain use cases where more dense energy, like an SMR, you can get more energy out of in a smaller package.
Sure.
Makes sense. And we're going to need humanoid robots are coming. I don't think we even start to realize what that's going to do from like a drain energy perspective. You know, we're swapping out all the energy that we use to eat into productivity for, you know, muscle movement is now going to the robot that needs energy, needs electrons.
Interesting.
To me, this isn't a pick one or the other. It's all needed. You need to invest in it. And this is where the scale of this is going. And any given one tiny little sliver of time,
Yes.
there's only so much money that can go into any one thing. But effectively, the only way to build data centers that scale into the hundreds of gigawatts and terawatts range that are dedicated to AI to bring the price down, you need to make this kind
So,
of bet.
so Aaron, we have two questions that have come in from the audience.
Yeah.
The first question is, uh, so that at some point in the future, whenever that might be, that space becomes the place where we actually get our power generated from. That's the first question. The second question is, how will orbital data centers disperse the heat they generate? Is that something that we should be concerned about? So the first question is,
Yeah.
will space become the preferred place that we generate and derive our power sources from? And the second question being, how will orbital data centers disperse the heat they generate?
Yeah. So I'll do the second first because it's kind of the more direct, easy question. Um, they disperse heat. Orbital data centers disperse heat through radiative cooling. So instead of AC or just flowing water over something where that's convection and conduction kind of cooling, this is radiative. So you basically have the heat. It does slowly radiate in a vacuum. So it's very cold in space. You put something that's hot over the chips. You run, it can be a liquid or whatever, through these fins, and then they radiate away. In a vacuum, you have what's called Stefan Boltzmann's law, which means the hotter something is, the less radiative area you need to radiate. It's a to the fourth power. So I mean, you run something a little bit hotter, you need the thing that you're radiating to be a lot smaller. So that's where basically that works. It's a very interesting mechanism. We've done a ton of deep dives. I would suggest going to our research where we spent 7 months into this, and a huge portion of that was on the thermal side, because there was a lot of people trying to hand wave it to, like, they didn't actually want to do the work and do the math. Once you do the math, you realize this is actually a relatively easily addressable engineering problem, but it is an engineering problem. This is not a physics problem. This is you just have to put a little bit of difference, time and energy into making two-sided radiators.
I mean, does it matter?
Then the
Why does it matter? Why is dispersion of heat generated by these devices? Why is that an important question for us here on Earth?
thermodynamics. So, um, energy can be neither created or destroyed, right? So the energy that's coming when we capture the energy in a solar panel in space, and this would be the same thing on Earth. But when you capture the energy in space, it goes into a chip. That chip basically flips a bunch of little switches. That's what the compute silicon is. These tiny little switches, zeros and ones, just trillions of them. So it does all the bit flipping, which is the work that we're asking it to do. And then what that does is that energy is being converted into heat, and that heat needs to go somewhere, otherwise the whole thing melts down. So it's basically a thermodynamic equation. So the reason this question comes up a lot is because there's been some people that's really tried to be very hand wavy out there. I think they have other incentives, but also it's just a performative skepticism thing. A lot of people like to act like it's a terrible idea, that someone's lying to you, because they get a lot of attention when they do that, and they waved this radiator thing, this heat dispersion thing, as something that they knew no one would look into, and they just said it's a physics problem or what have you. And so that got a lot of attention and a lot of pushback when Elon, Google, all these guys were going after it. They made it sound like they were trying to lie just to pump an IPO or something. I don't know. And so that's why that question exists. It's
Okay.
a mix of thermodynamics and that. Um, and then the power from space thing. I think this is we need as much energy as we can get. Earth, if you think about this, it's very hard for us as humans to really understand the scale of space. But if you think about the physics and just understanding how big, how small we are, I don't know if you remember the Carl Sagan little blue dot thing.
Yeah,
We're a
yeah.
pretty small speck.
Yep.
Um, just in the scale of the solar system, like one billionth or something, it's something very small of the energy that comes from the sun actually hits the earth. So even if we were to cover the entire planet in solar panels somehow, let's just say we did that, we would only be collecting one billionth the energy of the sun. And so if you at any scale, I don't want to say we have to go straight to, a billion times Earth scale of energy, but at any scale, if you want to collect energy, at some point in time that does move off of the planet. And so what the best ways to use this in theory, we're talking about now, let's bring it back to today's day and age, is if you can capture energy, do productive work in orbit, and the energy capture is effectively free once the capex is spent, and then you can send results back, then it's a pretty cheap way of doing it, and you don't have to fill up the land with all the data centers and all that stuff. We're going to have plenty of need for energy for robots and all these other things that are coming down the pipe. So this isn't a one or the other situation, but I think it's like a question of where do the physics give you the most advantage? Again, you get an advantage with collecting energy and moving Starlink. I'm on Starlink right now. That's
Okay.
my complete
Yes.
internet source. And that's just moving bits around. So from me to you in New York and back and all over the place, right? That's just moving this around. Then you have the data center component, which is saying, hey, we'll send bits up there, make them a little bit smarter, and give me the answer that I'm looking for. That's kind of an easy, an easy economic advantage, right? You move something up there, it becomes more valuable, and then you capture the difference. And so like that's where I think the next step is going. It's why orbital data centers are such a big deal, why it's so important to the space thesis, because now it's after internet, it's the first real big opportunity that is bringing commercial to space more than just defense. There's all these cool things with defense and NASA, and those are great. They can be hundreds of billions of dollar markets. But if you're talking about $1 trillion market that exists today and is growing quickly, putting a portion of that and a growing portion of that in space, it becomes very important to understand that thesis.
Now, Aaron, you mentioned that you're connected into the podcast via Starlink. I do want our audience to know that you are speaking to us from Space Island, Florida. So, in
Yeah.
case anyone was wondering. Um,
Yeah.
but listen, before we dive into some of your thoughts on the valuation of the upcoming SpaceX IPO, I do want to direct one other question from the audience, which I think is a very interesting one to you. And that is there any IP associated or predicted possible with the radioactive cooling solutions? Is
It's a
there
good
any,
question.
yeah, is there any IP
Yeah.
associated with or predicted possible with the radiative cooling solutions?
Yeah. So this is a good question. We've done, you know, hundreds of hours of diving into this stuff. So
Sure.
I can go quite kind of deep. I'll try and keep it higher level. But fundamentally, one of the biggest unknowns, we kind of know what we're doing with solar panels. It's basically just about making them bigger. So
Yes.
when we're rebuilding our satellites in a way. They're still basically the same function, but our satellites today, Starlink, there's 10,000 Starlink satellites over our heads right now. That's again how I'm getting our internet. There's like a huge, I forget the exact percentage. I want to say 20 to 40%. Don't quote me on that because I have too many numbers floating through my head. There's a huge portion of the payload of that satellite and the mass budget of that satellite dedicated to basically the communication payload. It's
Okay.
very power hungry. It is very power intensive. You're pushing a lot of things down. So if you take that away, basically now what's happening is these satellites are becoming a lot more like thermodynamic machines.
Okay.
That's how we think about it. It's all about capturing as much energy as possible passing it through something that turns it into valuable work, and then dissipating that heat. So the question here is, what are the IP associated with radiators? There's definitely IP associated with it because it's something that we haven't had to put as much effort into. We predict, basically SpaceX came out with what they're going to be doing for their satellite, and we had predicted very closely what this would look like back in like a month or two before that, because it's basically what's going to happen is they're going to be deployable
Okay.
radiators, meaning they're not just built into the system, they have to deploy, and they almost certainly have to be two-sided, meaning, like the heat can come out from both sides. As part of being deployable, there's some nuance there. There might be some materials improvements that can happen. I know that Redwired is doing some stuff on radiators, other people as well. StarCloud is made a claim multiple times publicly that that may be their most important IP is the radiator side. Um, there are probably multiple ways to skin that cat.
Okay.
I don't really like that that phrasing, but it is what it is. There are probably multiple ways to do that. But fundamentally, the physics would say you want as much radiative area as possible.
Okay.
And so
Cool.
there is some IP that will be built over time on that. I don't think there's going to be one silver bullet that makes it work.
Okay. So listen, I know I said we were going to, after that question, we were going to go into SpaceX, but I can't control these questions that are coming in from the audience
I
here.
love I love the questions
And we
because
got some
this is
smart
how I do
people
it.
here, some people that
Yeah.
know about space. So here's the question. Do you expect orbital installations to beam power to Earth, a la Reflect Orbital, or do you expect data centers to take all of that, all available power? Or is it a combination of both?
Yeah, this is probably a question of time, or like in what time frame we're talking about.
Okay.
Um, Reflect Orbital is talking basically, I believe, effectively only a mirror reflecting it down. It depends on your scaling. It has some issues. Overview Energy just announced a deal with Meta where
Okay.
they have basically big, really big solar panels in space. They have their IP payload that turns that into infrared light. So light that you can't see, but is there. And then they shoot that down at night to solar panels that are already on the ground, which actually infrared light converts better, interestingly enough, on solar panels than other wavelengths of the infrared of the light. But anyway, so they'll shoot that down at night. So like you wouldn't necessarily see a big spot beam in Reflect Orbital's component. They're like it's like a spot beam in the middle of the night. It's basically a big mirror because it's got the whole light spectrum in theory. Whereas Overview Energy would be doing just IR. So there are things that would happen there at some scale, and maybe this isn't to the terawatts and terawatts and terawatts. Okay, so I don't want to like get too far ahead of ourselves, but at some scale that starts to heat up the atmosphere. So like you can't, you don't want all of your power coming back down on Earth, especially when they're putting up a lot of infrastructure just to reflect more energy back to Earth when you could just put that a lot of the value producing architecture in space. Um, that's kind of the pitch on orbital data centers. Instead of like reflecting it down and doing a data center on Earth, why don't you just do bigger, put it in space in a grand scheme? And so just depends on scale. It's probably going to be some combination of both depending on where you're investing. If you're in a company that's very early stage and is just the value going from 100 million to 10 billion is a huge value capture, great. But if you're talking about, we're on a march to go from like less than 100 gigawatts of AI compute to 100 gigawatts, then to a terawatt of AI compute. If we're on that march, okay, the large long tail of that probably is some other mechanism. Also, then in theory, by the way, that same infrastructure would then just be used to point at, like Overview would be a good example. They're collecting all this, energy. Then they could just, instead of pointing it back at Earth, they could point it at the solar panels, in a different area to generate, power that are in orbit already. So there's different ways to do this. Fundamentally, I think from a value perspective, there's almost certainly going to be a combination of both. Um, I think when you're on planet, a principle of physics would be, if you're in a confined space, power density may win. So that's where your fission and
Yes.
nuclear, they're the most energy dense sources that we have today. So, you you don't want big expansive things on Earth. There's always going to be these scaling questions. Solar today on planet is easy to scale quickly, which is why you see such a growth there. Um, but nuclear may be the most dense where, you're not covering large chunks of land over time. So
Yes.
yeah,
Okay.
it's one of these things. At time in the right timeline and scale, it'll be all of the above.
Thank you. Thank you, Aaron. So let's pivot now and talk a little bit more specifically about SpaceX and your views on the upcoming IPO, in particular, the targeted valuation range, which, if I'm not mistaken, means that the value given to SpaceX exceeds the size of many, many companies in terms of GDP. And I know I'm sort of comparing apples to oranges a little bit, but when you think of it in those terms, it gives you some perspective on just how potentially valuable SpaceX will be. Can you please comment on that, Aaron?
Yeah. So there is a lot of grumbling and consternation going around with who I call the forward PE guys, uh, who basically they can only point to in today's day and age, you have Amazon that's close to 2 trillion. I forget what their most recent numbers are, but
Yeah,
close to that 2 trillion, and they have way more revenue, and then SpaceX is way less revenue and close to the same number. So they just that's about the laziest analysis you can do to create a point, which is why I call it performative skepticism. Skepticism with little to no work can create a lot of, attention value. So that's why you see so much of it. That's what exists on, the social media and what have you. They clearly have a point, right? If you were to just carve things down to only forward PE or backward looking PE, then, it looks like it's way overvalued. Okay, that's one way to tell a story. Then you can also realize that I think any intelligent investor knows that you're trying to predict the future. That's what investing is. You're not
yes,
trying to look backwards. Because if you did that, then everyone has the same information. There's no alpha there. You're trying to predict the future. You're trying to think a little bit down the line. So that's why we kind of anchor on rigorous optimism. So like what happens if it goes right? They say they're going to do this. What happens if it goes close to that, right? Kind of world. And then what are the physics constraints with which they can't really violate? They can say anything they want, they being SpaceX or whoever. But
right.
what are the kind of the true physics constraints as far as truth is concerned? Physics is kind of the most pure form of truth we have, right? We kind of know you can't violate, the first law of thermodynamics and things like that. Or if you can, we don't know how to. And so that's the kind of constraint boxes that we formulate for ourselves. And then we say, like, how does the engineering inside of these constraint envelopes can take many different form factors, but is it really difficult or not? So that's how we think about this. Anyway, all that to say, if you take all of that, look at the capacity that Starlink is driving through their stated goals, but also like realistically
Okay,
within the realm of physics goals, you can get to a $3 to $4 trillion valuation for Starlink, um, just Starlink as a business,
okay,
which is in just one line item inside of SpaceX. You can get to a $3 to $4 trillion valuation by 2030 quite easily. That assumes that they're able to get to the hundreds of thousands of I'm getting my gigawatts and bits and bytes and stuff all confused in my head right now, but you can get to, I think it's petabytes or petabits per second. I'm trying to remember what we are at when we're forecasting. Either way, what's
yeah,
happening over the next 2 years is like 100x
yeah. It sounds like big numbers.
that's
Whatever,
coming.
whatever it is, it's big numbers.
Yeah, it's a you think in gigabit per second. That's kind of how things happen in telco world.
Yeah,
But what's happening is they're dramatically improving their bandwidth from space over the next few years because they have all the things in place. So they have Starship. It's definitely within that window of time to be able to get to what they need to get as far as like getting these up into space. The cost to get them up into space is in the right direction, as well as the regulatory envelopes as well. Like the FCC just voted to allow them to increase their power flux densities, which somewhere like we're doing an analysis this week, so we'll release it tomorrow, but it looks like it might actually be more than 7x power increase, more than 7x bandwidth density opportunity for those people. That means the
Interesting.
fundamentally they can serve 7 times potentially. Don't quote me on these numbers because we're still in the process of doing this, but like a lot more people in the same area, which means, market penetration can go up. And so anyway, they have a lot of these things happening in that direction. It looks like we kind of base it on a capacity limiter, which is a true supply side
Okay.
driven kind of economic. And then you have all the orbital data center, all the AI, XAI stuff on top of that. So that's one of the things we're working on now is our SpaceX pre-IPO, like really ratcheting down on, okay, we know Starlink, we feel very good on Starlink because we've been modeling it for years. Now, like, how do you add XAI, potentially Cursor, orbital data centers into this? That's why we spent so much time on orbital data centers because that's the supply side of the compute. And so you need to really kind of marry those two things. So ultimately, I don't think 2 trillion is an issue. You just need to, believe that they
Okay.
can get Starship working and that Starlink is itself, I think the bottom, the low side of
Sure.
that
So Aaron,
outcome.
it sounds like this is, or at least the plan, right? The plan is that this is going to be a most valuable franchise. And most valuable franchises, I believe, typically have to some degree or another a moat that protects them. So, what is it about
Correct.
SpaceX that will enable it to protect this commanding position that it hopes to achieve in the marketplace?
Yeah, I'd say the competitive moats here, I've tried to like turn this into a meme because it's like it's just dramatic, the competitive moat that they have. No one
Sure.
else has been able to get to the levels of reusability and cost to space that they have. That's why everyone fixates on the only question that the competitor can fixate on, which is maybe we shouldn't even go to space. That's why they act. That's why the questions are always around: does orbital data centers even make sense? Should we put them with SMR? Should we? Because once you accept that they're going to space, there's really one person that owns the access, and that is SpaceX today. So basically, any business that exists in space for the next 5 to 10 years, um,
Okay.
there's really one ride to get there, and they own something like 80-90% of the upmass, and that because they are the ones that can give you a ride, but they can charge themselves cost and they can charge you
Right. They
whatever,
spread it out
because yeah.
over the
So the
time.
cost to get into space has definitely come down, even for externals, but it's come down for SpaceX much greater. So they have a huge advantage there. The closest competitor is Blue Origin, who recently had a launch failure, but they did at least land their
Right.
rocket. But that's like 10 years behind. And you can
So
argue,
would SpaceX have any antitrust concerns to have?
the, the political component to that is always a concern because that can ebb and flow. It would have to be depending on how you look at it, because from a Starlink perspective, you can't claim that I mean, they're pretty small compared to the telcos, but quite frankly, when you look at as far as market share dominance, their value might be different, but as far as market share, they're relatively small. And because they're kind of spread over the globe. On the space and defense side, potentially, but that's not even the biggest part of their business. So there are competitors coming up, but it just is fundamentally much harder to solve rocket science than it is to solve the kind of the AI algorithm. So it's like when I look at, you got a lot of these people that are like pointing to, okay, Anthropic is coming up or OpenAI is coming up potentially as an IPO opportunity. I just look back at the last 2 years and see how many times they've, kind of leaked each other as in capabilities or what have you. Or there's open source competition. You know who doesn't have an open source competition? A reusable rocket. Like, yeah, I bet they exist. I bet there's a plan out there, but do you want to use it? That's kind of the way I look at it. And so when you see that level of competitive mode on top of the compute capability that they already have compute on the ground, and then you layer in some of the other stuff, it becomes very, very robust because they've built so much capability in launch and then manufacturing. Like they manufacture, believes, I forget who said this. I think they're the largest U.S. electronics manufacturer because of the terminals that they put together,
Oh,
something
wow.
like that.
Interesting.
Um, they just build so many of these things, and they have such large production lines of capability for manufacturing capability that it's very hard to replicate. And that's why the moat's so strong, and that's why I look at, hey, Starlink business. When you're looking at value, I think that's your
Yeah.
low hanging. That's like your low part, right? Like everything on top of that is the opportunity. And when we talk to our institutional clients, that's kind of what we look at.
So
Say,
let me,
is it
you
three? Is it
mentioned
four?
Starlink.
What's on top?
So Aaron, you
Yeah.
mentioned Starlink, okay? And here's my question. Uh, you look back at the gold rush, 1849, California, right? Uh, a major event. And in retrospect, what we learned is that the people that made the most money weren't the folks that got the gold out of the ground. It was the people that were selling the picks and shovels, right? Levi's jeans, for example, being an enduring example of that. Uh, it strikes me that the Starlink business, the initiative, the concept, it's a picks and shovels business. Would you agree? And in that regard, it is well positioned to be quite valuable.
Yeah, I think another way of framing that, I think this came from the All In podcast, this claim. So maybe just, I think it sounds right. That's why I'm willing to repeat it. But they, during COVID, the only two things like business expenses that weren't canceled were your mobile phone and your electricity.
Yeah,
Like
interesting.
people stopped paying for their cars and all that other stuff when there was that little blip. Um, Again, like even if it's more directionally informative than has to be explicitly, super correct, but that's how important the connectivity is to people. Um, so yes, I believe it's fundamental to the modern age. Once you start building AI on top of that, then yes, you need to connect your end use work to the ultimate, kind of the intelligence layer, and then back again. It's incredibly important to have the connection layer. So yeah, it makes it even more, you know, fundamental to the building economy on top of AI. And then you start to layer in all the other stuff on top of that. It's quite interesting. But yes, the connection layer is very important. I think that's one of the reasons what I've looked at when we're modeling Starlink. We think one of the like the misses to the upside for some people that are modeling Starlink, they get very they get very fixated on ARPU, and they're using traditional telco examples. I think, you know, that's fundamentally wrong because these guys are selling a commodity, right? It's an important commodity. Connection is an important commodity, but it's basically dollar per megabit per second kind of thing. Um, the reason, here's my belief that's coming up. I have a decent amount of conviction behind this belief, and I think others should as well. Um, the reason Amazon's also getting into the game, and they just spent $10 billion on basically a spectrum that only works from space. Um, and as these are starting to evolve, what you're seeing is that there's an increasing demand to build digital services envelope on top of the main connection layer. Because I don't know about you, but I don't know anyone that likes their telco provider. It's like a abusive relationship in most cases. I don't know of anyone, oh, I love my, my mobile
Oh,
provider.
you're hitting a hot button here because
Yeah.
my wife and I are debating. Is it the cable company or the telephone company? Who do you
Yeah.
want to do? Who's easiest to do business with? And
Yeah.
neither
And
one
like,
is particularly easy to do business with.
yeah, you call them up 45 minutes on the line just to tell them
Oh,
to
I
reset your
got it.
router, right? So we're basically abused by these folks because it's a requirement. But what's happening is I think you see Amazon and SpaceX doing this. SpaceX has the business services that they have that they can layer in on top of that are X related, the social media related, and AI related, so they can layer in Grok as well. So I think you start to see those bundles create a lot more stickiness with your service provider.
Sure.
And then you can imagine Amazon, imagine Prime bundled with your internet, right? Like that's a pretty sticky service as well. I think that's what
Right.
they see evolving over the next few years And the advantage from space that they get by doing the cell towers in space is that they get global ubiquitous coverage, and they can do what I call an outside in strategy, which is your basic everywhere is covered. Like you're always going to have some kind of connection. You know that. You can go to the ends of the earth. You don't really care. Then they flipped the coverage gaps from location based to density based, which is interesting because the people with the highest density coverage, fiber, there's tons of them, right? So you'd rather be the one that can get you global ubiquitous coverage and then flip the customer ownership story from I own everywhere. And then when you go to a city, I have a partnership with T-Mobile or whoever that gives me the coverage gap
Sure.
while I'm in the city. So I call it, moving from Grand Canyon to Urban Canyon coverage gaps. So I think that's what they're doing. And then they get to build very sticky long-term value with their customers because they don't really want to leave. The connectivity is basic and needed. But everything else on top is the reason you get a little bit more margin or
Okay.
you have a lifetime value that's longer.
So Aaron, we're rapidly running out of time here, and I want to make sure that we cover
Yeah.
everything that you think is important. And one question comes to mind, and that is the synergies and multi-domain expansion that are in the offing as a result of the all-stock acquisition of XAI SpaceX. So can you talk a little bit about that and why that's so strategically important?
Yeah. It's interesting because um, again, the performative skeptic position again is they're incentivized for attention. So it's like, okay, hey, they were just bailing out XAI. That was a common thing with other examples with Elon. So sure, you can argue that's fine. In reality, what you see is if you can build, like we talked about, the connectivity layer with the intelligence layer, then you get a
Sure.
lot of potential value. Um, SpaceX, Elon historically has just been very, 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 very good at vertical integration. I think this is just the full AI stack extension, all the way from the actual energy that plugs into the compute to the end user application. One thing I think that's important, and this is going to get a little bit deeper on the AI side of things than traditionally people would go into, but the orchestration layer has proven to be much more valuable than some of the AI groups initially thought, XAI included. um, and Elon has said that they kind of took the wrong path, and that's part of the reason I believe you see this acquisition for
Okay.
Cursor. It's an orchestration layer. Plug your LLM into the right orchestration, which allows you to get the best of both worlds: deterministic code, probabilistic code, which is a lot more like how the human brain works. Like you have some, give and take, emotion versus intelligence, and there's different components of the brain that do things differently. And
Sure.
so that's seems to be where things are headed. And so when you can combine all of that in addition to the distribution of X, then you get a very, very juicy potential kind of stack, AI stack with access to, in theory, near limitless compute once you plug in Terafab and the ability to launch it and get it there. So that they're leveraging their competitive advantage, which is building a ton of satellites and launching them into space. And then they're saying, "Hey, we're gonna vertically integrate the entire stack." It's the only real opportunity there. You have to be able to underwrite that you think that that's a
And
cherry on
Aaron,
top of the
why are
Starlink
or
story.
are there any serious competitors or competitive threats to this consortium of companies led by or this SpaceX entity? How come there's no one out there nipping at their heels?
I would say that it just depends on what nipping at your heels, how's
Where
that's
are the
defined.
Chinese in all this, right? Because we know
Yeah.
that Musk has a car company, I believe,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Well,
and
the Chinese, by the way, are they're further ahead than anyone on orbital data centers. So I think that's one thing. If you need a
okay,
signal to chase that's not just math, look at what China's investing into orbital data centers. They
but do
just
they have the
announced
same capability to put the data centers up into orbit?
they're number two in launch to
Okay,
space. And then US commercial, number two, opportunity is likely. I don't think technically they haven't done as many launches, but they have the capability and are close. And that's Blue Origin, which is a,
right.
Jeff Bezos, Amazon aligned company. So I think if you're looking at like who's number two potential from a commercial perspective, it probably is a combination of Amazon and Blue Origin. Blue Origin has submitted with the FCC orbital data center requests.
Right.
Right? So like they believe it's happening. They're planning on it happening, and they're building for it to happen. Bezos has been pretty consistent about this years and years ago. He said we'd be doing data centers in space. So this is not like a new thing. It's just the timing, execution wise. Now they're on the heels, so to speak, of SpaceX, but the heels, just because of how hard it is, it might be they're currently, at a 10-year gap behind them, and so they might be, chewing that down to a 5-year advantage, so on and so forth. But if you said in AI someone had a 5-year advantage, who that they would not be looked at as skeptically, I think, as some of the others.
So, Aaron, what I really
uh,
want to know, you mentioned Jeff
yeah,
Bezos, and what I
yeah.
really want to know is when are Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk going to be fighting in Las Vegas?
Uh,
I'm very, I'm hopeful that
I
that
think they're
fight
fairly
can be
cordial.
arranged.
I think they're fairly cordial. No one wants to lose. But Jeff's approach is different. It's like, slow is fast is his approach. So, in theory, that's why you
Sure.
see the rocket, in some ways doing a little bit better, but it hasn't as many shots on goal. Whereas the SpaceX approach is just, we don't know what we don't know. Let's try not to be so egotistical, throw a bunch against the wall, and then, build from there. That's why they're 12 launches into their big system, and New Glen's only two or three. I'm trying to remember now. So they will, I think,
Okay.
eventually clash. I don't think there's many other opportunities there. And then
Sure.
everyone else has got to compete, by the way, your telcos or whoever, they're going to have to kind of, merge with other people.
Yes.
Maybe they buy AST, Verizon buys AST or something, or some conglomeration of this group comes together and tries to compete.
So, Aaron, in the remaining time that we have, what I'd like to ask you, I would like to talk a little bit actually about Starship, because I think
Yeah.
most of what you've discussed up to this point are more what I would call near-term opportunities, and would appear to be clearly realizable. Let's talk a little bit about the future. And I think Starship really unlocks entirely new markets, a lunar economy, Mars logistics, things like that, defense mobility. Can you speak to that in our remaining time, please?
Yeah, Starship is very, very, very important. It's kind of what I, describe when I talk about a 10-year advantage. I'm actually talking about the old rocket, not the new. This new rocket is maybe even extending their advantage because it's
Right.
designed to be fully reusable, but it's also just bigger. So when you put up more mass, your denominator for cost per kilogram gets bigger. So you get to reduce your cost per kilogram because you just are putting more up. And so as that as that scales, it's incredibly important. Now, Starlink capability, the 3 to 4 trillion that I'm mentioning, that is based on it working, Starship working. So some of this is baked a little bit nearer term. Then there's that what you're talking about are like things in the 2030s that start to unlock. So I would
Well,
call it,
2030s are around the corner, my friend. I mean, it's
yeah. In my experience, people on Wall Street long term can mean anything from 18 months to, and then the venture,
yes.
it's like 10-year. They're very different definitions. Um, so, but Starlink V3, that's the next one. That's where you get like a 50x increase in capacity on orbit. That is a very big deal, and Starship is a component that's required for that. They're already in their 12th flight. They're coming up on their 12th flight soon. And so I have a lot of confidence that this is solved and it's ready to launch these Starlinks within a year. It's basically a choice is when they want to do it. They're trying to solve many things at once, and so yeah, if they just wanted to prioritize, they could do it. They could probably do it in the next few months if they wanted to prioritize putting those satellites up. It's up to them, kind of frankly. So you have Starlink built on top of that. Then you have the orbital data center narrative built on top of that. That can start to kind of go at the same time over the next few years, but we assume that it scales closer to the turn of the decade, 2030. And then beyond that, you have the lunar economy, which is becoming that's like the more near term. And then beyond that, I think is the Martian. stuff that's happening. So the lunar stuff has been accelerated given the Artemis things that they're working on with
Yes.
NASA and the current administration asking people to accelerate the Artemis plan. You've seen them move forward and say, "Hey, lunar stuff is coming faster." So it's very important because there's really no way to get the tonnage to the lunar surface outside of what Starlink is hoping, or sorry, Starship is hoping to be able to
Okay.
produce. Again, these are like development cycles that
So
can extend, but it's a time frame.
let's put a bow on top of all this, and let me ask you to offer the audience some closing thoughts on SpaceX and our future, our what appears to be a quite bright one in space.
Yeah, I would say that you should be thinking about the orbital infrastructure build out that's happening. It's not just the telco side. You're seeing AI compute side being placed on top of that. Space is becoming quite an important part of the investment cycle. It kind of breaks the GICS model, so you got to think about how you're
Yeah.
allocating or not. What your exposure looks like. It may not be traditional to think about. And then, if you are interested in the space ecosystem, it's very tempting to just go for the value options that aren't SpaceX, but understand that execution in space is very difficult. Um, very difficult. So there is a premium that would be, placed on top. And I would guesstimate that the market currently doesn't appreciate how much of a premium it should be to actually execute in the aerospace domain. So I would put those are some of my closing
Okay.
thoughts if you're thinking about investing.
Well, unfortunately, our time is up. And I'd like to thank Aaron Burnett, founder and CEO at Mach 33 Financial Group, for sharing his insights and experience on this very important topic